Let me just quickly introduce myself and tell you a little my background, and then we'll ask Steve to do the same. I am the founder and CEO of Fume. We're a Napa Valley-based cannabis company, vertically integrated. We have our first brand in the market called Lake Gray, which you can find on the Ease platform, and will be in dispensaries near you over the coming year. I've had two tracks in my life. I've been an entrepreneur and a politician, and involved in public policy. As an entrepreneur, I started a chain of restaurants called Burrito Brothers in Washington, D.C. a number of years ago, sold it in '99. Then I started a winery called Alpha Omega in Napa Valley in Rutherford on Highway 29. Sold that in 13 and started Fume then. Parallel with that, I worked on presidential campaigns in my 20s, all losing campaigns, which was the 80s. It tells you which party I'm with. And then I served like Steve as a local official. I was a planning commissioner, city council member, and vice mayor of St. Helena in Napa Valley. Did that for about 10 years. And then more recently, Governor Brown appointed me about 6 years ago, I think it is, to the California Fish and Game Commission, where I've been serving as president of that commission for 5.5 of those 6 years. My term goes for another couple years. So I've had this kind of parallel of politics, policy, and cannabis, which has been very useful in this crazy space we're in. And I'd really like to welcome Steve Young. Steve is a council member in Benicia, in the Northeast Bay, San Francisco Bay Area. And he's running for mayor now, I believe, in Benicia. Steve, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and then also how you came to cannabis as a topic?
Okay, thank you, Eric. I spent my career in local government managing affordable housing and community development and redevelopment programs. I retired in 2008 as the community development director in Sacramento, where I was in charge of, among other things, military base conversions of Mather and McClellan Air Force bases. I retired relatively early. I moved with my family to Costa Rica, where we lived for 4 years, to give my daughter the experience of living in a different culture. She went to high school there. Upon graduation, she came back to the States to go to college, and we decided that we didn't want to be that far away, so we repatriated, if that's the right word, as well, and settled in Benicia. I didn't know anybody here. I wanted to get involved in the community. So given my background in government, I applied for a number of city government appointments. I got appointed to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission soon took up the most controversial project that the city had seen in a long time. Our biggest employer is Valero Refinery. They wanted to switch how they brought oil in from ships to trains. They wanted to bring in fracked oil from North Dakota. It was a dangerous proposition. A number of cities who were going to have the trains pass through their community were up in arms about it. But Benicia was the only one that had any authority because we had to issue a permit for Valero to construct the offloading terminal. I spent a lot of time learning about this stuff. I knew how to read environmental documents. Normally what happens with this kind of stuff is it just, as you know, Eric, they just load you up with a host of technical documents and expect people to not be able to understand them or read them and to rely on the staff. The staff was pushing us hard, but I was convinced that it was a dangerous project for the community. I didn't organize, but I led the Planning Commission effort that ultimately defeated the application. At the end of my term in 2016, it was made clear to me I wasn't going to get reappointed. And so I decided to run for council instead. And I won. I had the most votes of anybody who ran that year. And that was the same election of Prop 64. So Prop 64 passed in Benicia with 63% of the vote. And there was, at that time, a majority on the council that recognized that there was some benefits to the community from getting into the cannabis business or allowing businesses to operate in Benicia. The swing vote was a guy who's ordinarily conservative, but he owned a house in Oregon, and he understood that having dispensaries in his town in Oregon was no big deal at all. And so he remained consistent, and we had the 3 votes to approve a series of policies that essentially legalized cannabis. Of course, the most controversial part was the dispensaries. We went through a long, almost 2-year process of hearing from everybody in the community on this issue. Of course, one of the arguments is, well, we passed Prop 64 with 63%, but that doesn't mean we want dispensaries in Benicia. And it got so weird at one point that the school district, as an entity, came out in opposition for what the city was contemplating doing, which is unheard of for one government entity to formally oppose what a different government entity is considering. But they did it. At the end, we ended up approving it. We set up this very elaborate application process that required a $20,000 non-refundable deposit to the city, as well as showing site control, which meant that the cities had to, or the applicants had to rent space. So they were on the hook for the rents, and then the city, in my opinion, sort of slow walked the process. It took over a year for this process to play out, where ultimately we ranked the applicants. The top ranked applicant was able to go to the planning commission and get a use permit. It was appealed to the city council. The city council, on a split vote with one recusal, ended up approving it. People who were anti-cannabis lost their mind over this, partly because it was this particular location was right across from a residential neighborhood. It was zoned commercial, which was what was required, but it was across the street from a residential neighborhood. The police chief, who was sort of leading the effort of the vetting of the applicants, liked these guys. He said that he came from Berkeley, and he was involved in regulating dispensaries in Berkeley. He said these were the most sophisticated and professional operators he'd ever seen. And the location was 2 blocks from the police department. So those two things were important. The thing got approved, and then ultimately we decided we'd put a ballot measure on in November to settle the question once and for all: do Benicia want dispensaries in town? Yes or no? It's an advisory measure. It's not going to change anything necessarily. But I at least pledged that I'd follow the will of the voters, even though I'm pro-dispensary and pro-cannabis businesses. I said that if the voters said that they didn't want any more, I would honor that.
You still will allow the one, right? The one that's been approved is good.
We'll still allow the one. My opponent, who's also on the council, refused to take the same pledge. So we'll see how that plays out.
Really interesting, Steve. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Politicians in different jurisdictions use the same arguments in different ways. In Napa, they've said all that the people voted for was access. In other words, dispensaries. And so, there's, I think in general, a lot of elected officials who just don't want to take the chance. They don't maybe even care either way personally, but they're just blocking the access to dispensaries. And clearly the lack of dispensaries in California overall is one of the biggest flaws in our whole system, because until we get that retail up and running, the whole rest of the supply chain isn't going to work well. So really interesting what you've done in Benicia and how you are going to have a dispensary, but do the advisory role. What are the kinds of things that applicants can do in the process to help in the cities and writing ordinances, getting ordinances passed? And also once it's passed, what can they do to help make this a successful partnership?
I think one of the things that applicants need to do is to be educated and aware of the local dynamics. They probably aren't different in most suburban communities. The anti-cannabis thing is always, what about the kids? Which has never made any sense to me, because kids aren't going into dispensaries. And the whole purpose or one of the purposes of legalization was to try to cut back in black market sales. Kids who use it, they're still going to use it. They're still going to buy it on the streets. That's not going to change. But I think for the applicants, they need to understand the dynamics, and that, for example, the successful applicant in Benicia did things like join the Chamber of Commerce, agreed to hire union workers to pay union scale. He dedicated part of the dispensary to a art gallery to show local art and have artists be able to sell their paintings. And he understood that a large portion of cannabis users in Benicia were people my age, people over 55, who showed up in mass to say, we don't want to have to drive to Vallejo, which is 5 miles away and has 10 dispensaries. Yeah, because that was the argument, was like, well, you just drive to Vallejo and buy it. Why do we have to have it here? So for a lot of seniors to say, A, I want to keep my tax money here, B, I don't want to have to drive to Vallejo, those were compelling arguments for some. So I think to show that you're a good civic citizen by doing these kinds of things and argue against the stereotype of a bunch of stoners hanging out in the parking lot. But instead,
interesting argument on the yeah, an interesting argument on the driving too. Then another clear argument is that we're trying to reduce greenhouse gases, and the surest way to do that is to provide local businesses in where people live, so they don't have to get in a car and drive, whether it's 5 miles. In my case with St. Helena, where they banned dispensaries, we have to drive to to Napa, the city of Napa, 30 miles away, or even Vallejo, 45, 50 minutes away, to go into a brick and mortar dispensary, which was not what was intended here. One issue that's been a big one in this state of California has been delivery. Prop 64 said that delivery companies could be licensed and to deliver to adult users of the product, adult customers. And then a bunch of cities tried to ban delivery from coming into their cities. Where is Benicia on that, and where is that battle sit right now?
Well, initially there was talk about, well, we need to have all the delivery companies register with the police department. And so that we know that if somebody's coming in and they have product, that they are legitimate. Ultimately, we did not go with that request because these are people driving, unmarked cars. It doesn't say cannabis on the side of it. They're going to have paperwork showing that they are legitimate anyway. So we sort of allow delivery, and that the fact that we allowed delivery was also an argument that the anti-cannabis people used. Is that, well, people can get this stuff anyway. Why do we have to have a dispensary? Right. So I think you got to be aware of sort of the dual edges of that particular argument.
Okay, 2 more questions before we run out of time. One is, so you talked a little bit about what applicants can do to have a greater chance of success applying in a city. What can the industry do overall? We're looking both in California, but generally across the country. What can the industry do to increase the chances of success with local officials?
Well, I think, as I said, I think changing the focus perhaps of your customers. Who is it you're serving? And I think as at least in our town, as people age, and we know that there is a significant portion of the baby boomer generation that are users and consumers, that you should be appealing, that we're serving seniors, we're serving boomers. It's not just slackers and stoners and guys who are going to hang out in the parking lot. You need to sort of change the focus of who your customer base is, and make it clear that when people come in to buy something, they're in and out. It's a 10-minute, 15-minute transaction, and it's not something that's going to necessarily cause people to loiter, which is, I think, one of the big things. And the other argument is, if you put these things in downtown locations, you're going to attract foot traffic to other businesses that are potentially beneficial, not just cookie places that somebody might want to go to, but all your restaurants, all your art galleries, all your places downtown could conceivably benefit from having a dispensary nearby. Right.
So, given the economic crisis we're in, and main streets, particularly in smaller, towns like St. Helena and Benicia, are really struggling with a lot of storefronts that are open, and more that are going to become open in the coming weeks. That's a really strong argument. Last quick question, Stephen, and that is, it's the season of polls and prognostication, but in small races like council races and local ballot measures, we don't do polls because they're just too expensive. So, what's your best guess on how your town's going to vote on this ballot measure in November that you got?
I think it's going to pass. Prop 64 got 63%. We had a tax measure giving the council the right to set taxes. That passed at over 71%. There was a local social media poll that was done about the one dispensary that was going to open, and it got over 60% approval. So I think I'm on the right side of the issue. I'm happy to be on a particular side. My opponent's on the other side. So, from my personal campaign perspective, I think I'm on the right side, and I think it's going to pass.
Great, Steve. Listen, really appreciate your time. Good luck in your race. We're all going to be watching both to see how you do and how the ballot measure does, and hopefully we'll be calling you mayor come later this year.
And the last thing I'd like to say is, for anybody who's watching and is the industry, We have very low taxes. We have a big industrial park that we're welcoming all businesses, manufacturers, not dispensaries, but distributors and labs, cultivators. So if people want a centralized location with a lot of easy rail access and freeway access to the Bay Area, I hope you'll look at Benicia.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Really appreciate your being here.